Good evening. I have to look to see what my name is. My name is Tom Crickelaire, and I am the treasurer here at the Jesup. I'd like to welcome you all here this evening. It's my great pleasure to introduce my good friend, Gray Cox. I was going to say Professor Gray Cox, but then I remembered that traditionally Quakers don't use titles. We're all equal, right? As they say at the Criterion Theater, if you've been to the theater, we are all disposable here. Gray is a professor of philosophy, peace studies, and language learning at the College of the Atlantic. He's published a lot of papers about interesting things and a bunch of books as well. Philosophy books, peace studies, great stuff. He's a member of Acadia Friends Meeting, as am I. He is also the clerk of the Quaker Institute for the Future. Gray is also a musician, and most notably, a very kind and thoughtful guy. Gray and I we carpool together to Quaker meeting in Northeast Harbor, and I have great opportunities to talk with him on going and coming. And then we sit in my driveway sometimes for 40 minutes. One time my kids, we were standing out on the driveway talking about a philosophical subject. I, like Gray, studied philosophy when I was in graduate school. And I came in the house and one of my daughters said, "What are you guys doing out there?" Just talking about interesting things. I was privileged to read an earlier draft of Gray's new book. And I'm going to give a very brief observation about Gray's book. Each of us spends an extremely large amount of time thinking. We're thinking all the time. We usually do this pretty much the same way, over and over again. Each of us lives in our own personal little thinking box. We spend our entire lives, mostly silently, talking to ourselves. I have a sentence here that I crossed out about talking to ourselves. Even though I crossed it out, the sentence is, have you ever had a very long conversation with an extremely boring person? Well, Gray introduces us to some new, refreshing ways of thinking. He shows us interesting and creative ways to get out of our usual thinking boxes. And in the process, to my mind, what he's giving us is a new and special kind of optimism for the future. Welcome, Gray.
Thanks so much, Tom. Thanks a lot. It's great. Thanks for those remarks. Well, I'd like to welcome you all to this session and just say also that I want to give thanks to being back here. I've talked before here, and in fact, I've talked about some of the themes of this book here before, and it's great to come back now that this book is finished to sort of talk about it and share some things with it. My goals for tonight, I want to share some key ideas from the book. I'm not going to try and summarize all of it, but kind of give you an overview of some key things. And also try and give you a little bit of a feel for the book. So I want to give you some key ideas, give you the feel of the book, and also I'd like to interest you in reading it and having further dialogue about it and system change, which the book is about, and in particular dialogue about dialogue, about how we have dialogue is an important part of what it's about. And though normally when I do talks, I don't like to read during the talks very much. Tonight I am going to read some things from the book because I figured, well, give you an idea of what's in store for you if you do read it, okay? And so to start off, I thought I'd read just a couple paragraphs from the preface that share just a little bit about how I got going on it, and then some paragraphs from the introduction to give you sort of a prologue to what it's all about. So work on this book was sparked by two strong reactions that I had on first reading Ray Kurzweil's book, The Singularity is Near. One strong reaction was a fascination with the dream of an empowering artificial intelligence, or AI, with very practical payoffs. Might it help blind people read, bring important advances in medicine, empower democratic processes, and address intractable ecological problems? The second strong reaction was a nightmarish vision of the exponential growth of forms of AI that might run seriously awry. Might they ruin our food systems, escalate wars with lethal autonomous weapons, or create dangerous artificial superintelligences that are indifferent to humans, or maybe even outright unfriendly to us? I soon realized that even if AI never exceeds or even equals the full range and level of general human intelligence, the dramatic advances in AI technologies already transforming our world raise all sorts of ethical issues. They pose real threats even while offering real benefits. In wrestling with these issues, I was forced to revisit some basic questions. What is it to think and act ethically? What is intelligence or rationality? What is the role of the community in nurturing and supporting ethical thought and action? How is rational thought and ethical action framed differently in arenas like economics, or politics, or technology? And how do institutions in those realms influence each other and our collective vision of intelligent, rational life? So those were the kinds of questions that got me going. And to help frame the book in the introduction, I started off in part one, which is entitled Wiser Thinking. Part two is Wiser Earth. In the introduction in the following way, first with a quote from Plato, always good to quote. Until political power and love of wisdom are joined, bad things do not cease. When I was working in construction as a high school kid, an old timer watched me run around grunting and scurrying for a couple of days. Then he gave me a piece of advice. Work smarter, not harder. It was good advice. It led me to spend more time watching, learning, and thinking about the details of what I was doing. I got significantly more efficient in accomplishing the goals at hand. Nowadays, I see us all scurrying around in a different set of ways. As individuals, we often obsess on the goal at hand, but lose track of the larger frames of our lives. Often the result is burnout, addiction, divorce, health collapse, or some other life crisis. In analogous ways, we often find leaders of corporations, countries, and technology teams pursuing single-minded goals with a one-sided logic. This may let them shine for a while as the best and the brightest, but the results can often lead to widespread damage and even disaster. Currently, the logic of our collective effort at economic growth is pushing our ecosystem towards collapse. The logic of our international politics is pushing us towards wars of mutually assured destruction. And the logic of our technological development is pushing us towards a smarter planet in which all the key systems will be run by artificial intelligences that are beyond human comprehension and control. what kind of thinking might be most helpful in this context as our world becomes increasingly dominated by those kinds of logic and their implementation through smart phones, as well as smart cars, farms, factories, schools, cities, and smart battlefields. In this new context, we may need to seek ways to follow this advice. Live wiser, not just smarter. The aim of this book is to explore what that might mean. It looks at how we can develop and practice forms of wisdom that help us deal with the shortcomings and the limitations of the smart technologies that increasingly pervade our lives. It looks as well at the related logics of the economics, politics, and technological development that threaten our world with damage and potential disaster. Mainstream practices of economics, politics, and technological development that threaten our world, mainstream practices of economics, politics, technology, and ethics have institutionalized the practice of a core conception of rationality that we need to change. Okay. So that's sort of the core starting point of the book. And so clearly it's taking on a lot. Right? And part of what I tried to do in the book is vary styles. So tonight I'm going to do a little bit of that. I tell some stories, and I have some theoretical analysis of economics and develop an alternative theory of the firm, and there's some history and a lot of ethics and philosophy and so on, some fables, and there's some songs too that are part of the book, which are put there not just as decoration, but because they, I think, offer part of the message of the book and maybe even the argument in an important sense. And I thought I might start at this point tonight with one short song that helps me settle down when I'm trying to take on big issues, like the whole set that I just started to allude to, and I'm going to say more about tonight. So if you'll bear with me, it helps me settle down and may help put you in the mood as well. I hope it does. It's a song called Slow Right Down. Oh, I'm gonna slow right down. Yes. So I can get there sooner. Oh, yes. I'm gonna slow right down. So I can get there today. I'm gonna slow right down. Oh, maybe even come to a full stop. Oh, maybe if I come to a full stop, I'm gonna get there right away. Yes. Thanks. Well, so to start, let me let's see here if I can get there we go. That was the song we just sang. The starting point for a lot of the analysis of the book in the first substantive chapter has to do with the golden rule, right? Which a lot of Christians, a lot of Jews, lots of theologians from all around the world argue is kind of a fundamental good guideline for living. And in reflecting on it, I came to the conclusion that that's a mistake, that the golden rule is not a good rule to follow. And I want to say a little bit about why and what the alternative would be, right? The alternative is what we might call the rainbow rule. So the golden rule is the one that says, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, right? It basically invites you to take your values and impose them on everybody else, right? To say, well, okay, whatever I would like, I'm going to act, I'm going to treat other people that way, assuming that they would like the same thing, right? What the rainbow rule says instead is that we should do unto others as they would have us do unto them. So it invites us to think about the world from their point of view, from their values, as a starting point in collaborating with them and negotiating with them, okay? And in the book, part of what I tell some stories about my grandmother who used to follow the golden rule a lot. And she had some very definite ideas about how everybody should live and what they should eat for breakfast and whether or not they should breastfeed or not in public and whether they should belong to a union as an electrician and all kinds of stuff. And she was very good because she was kind of a matriarch of an extended family. As a matriarch of an extended family, she was pretty good at treating other people the way she wanted to be treated and getting them to behave the way she wanted them to behave. And, but also I think a lot of missionaries have gone in different parts of the world, including Indiana and parts of the United States, with the idea that they should treat indigenous people the way they as Christians would like to be treated, for example. And they might assume that if they were pagans, they would like to be converted, right? So the golden rule has, in many cases, invited people to impose their conception of civilization and morality and religion on other folks out of good intention. In that sense, I think that the golden rule is in important sense egocentric and ethnocentric, and it's sort of a recipe for colonization, right? Now, I should qualify that because there are contexts in which I think the golden rule makes perfectly good sense, right? And those are situations in which other people are like us. So like if I'm out on a playground and, somebody else is playing with a toy and I take it and the teacher comes over and says, now, Gray, what if Mary did that to you, right? Well, I can sort of get the point. I can appreciate why maybe I shouldn't have stolen the toy from her because what goes around comes around on the playground, right? Okay. And similarly, if I'm in a business community with other business people who have similar values and norms, then it might make sense to treat them the way I would like to be treated, right? But if I'm dealing with people from another country, another culture, another religion, or who are different in some other way, it's important to sort of consider the possibility that I should really look at the world from their point of view. And this kind of thing happens in all sorts of cultural contexts. I want to read another passage from the book that sort of illustrates this, okay? And this was with my encounter with my daughters. growing up, having them grow up here on the island. I hope it'll start to illustrate what I mean by this. I grew up spending a good deal of time outdoors, and clothing was a tool that enabled me to bushwhack through brush and catch trout in a cold spring stream. As for how my outfits looked, getting muddy and messed up was inevitable, and I wasn't going to be staring in any mirrors out on the trail, so why care about how I looked? Later, as a parent of young girls, I found myself in repeated conflict whenever we dressed and packed to go on some outing. Attitudes, and I had twins as the youngest, and so they sort of gang up on me, and I had to try and gang up on them. Whenever we dressed and packed to go on some outing, attitudes and practices around clothing are strongly influenced by a variety of cultural values and institutions, which are typically strongly informed by patriarchal gender systems. But in conflicts with my daughters over dressing for these outings, for quite a while, I gave no thought to such larger cultural considerations. I thought my daughters were each just plain foolish in what they kept wanting to put on their feet and wear as outfits. I would try to make them dress in ways I was sure were appropriate for their own good. only to hear a stream of whining and refusal. But then I began to have conversations that shed light on related questions, like, which were major questions for me, like, why did girls like to play at dressing up and having weddings? It may seem like a silly thing to wonder for you all, but growing up, I found this really puzzling. Why did women sometimes spend an hour or more a day getting dressed to go out? Why did they puncture holes in their ears so they could hang things from them that might get caught in their hair? Why would they wear shoes that made it hard to run and get out of the way of an oncoming car? I was really mystified by these things, right? I found these questions puzzling in a very basic way until I heard replies like, the way you look affects the way other people perceive, experience, and relate to you. And relationships are central to life. It makes sense to practice dressing up for special occasions and play imaginatively at taking part in events that may be the most decisive in your life. Reflection led me to see my daughters had a systematically different way of looking at the world. Contrasting viewpoints like this provide great material for comedians. They can make us laugh uproariously at the incongruity of the 2 points of view. For example, Dad, we're going to hike the rock face of a mountain where it might suddenly rain and you want to wear those flimsy little shoes? Daughter, you want me to go out in public where I might see my friends or meet some new boys and you want me to wear those ugly clunky things on my feet? Dad, nobody's going to care what you look like when you're tromping out on the trail. Daughter, if nobody is going to care what I look like, then why are we doing this in the first place? Dad, because it's an adventure. Daughter, what is wrong with you? Why are you so weird? Just like other people in positions of power, parents can feel they have the right as well as the duty to impose their judgments on others for their own good. The golden rule invites just that way of thinking. To children in subordinate positions of power, such impositions can seem self-centered, uncaring, unloving, and egocentric. And there's often considerable truth in that perception. But typically, the person in power means well. In trying to get my daughters to dress as I thought appropriate, I was trying to do right by them, given my worldview. In that sense, the conflict here was between two communities, me and the fellow adventurers who didn't mind looking a mess, versus my daughters in their world of women who cared, and others, who cared very much about appearances and how they framed and affected relationships. Much everyday conflict at home, work, and the world at large turns on differences like these. I found solutions to the great clothing wars by backpacking extra clothing for when the cold and wet made them ready to sacrifice appearance for comfort. And on their side, they learned to negotiate plans for outings and preparations, including clothing purchases that allow them to dress in attractive ways and bring friends. Two things softened me up over time for these negotiations. First, I recalled how I felt as a child when my mom and grandmother had imposed their clothing preferences on me. And then second, my daughters became increasingly effective in nonviolent, though sometimes not very civil, resistance to my authority. Yeah. Oh, no, I didn't mean to. Sorry. I was touching them because of the book. Thanks for catching that. Okay. So, so much for the golden rule as a kind of a starting point. And so now I spent a little time on that in some depth because it gives you sort of a contrast between two basic ways of approaching how we relate to others and think about reasoning with them. This is a chart of kind of two paths of thinking that the book discusses. And the bottom path is the one that I critique and that I think is characteristic of dominant institutions in our society. And it goes from the golden rule to, as a sort of starting point, to a method of reasoning that I'll say more about, but involves algorithmic inference or linear reasoning. And then it ends up with a kind of vision of the world as a smarter planet, in which people use algorithmic reasoning in their ethics, their economics, their politics, and their technology. Right? And the book is about how those things happen. And it has a very significant chunk of it that's about technology in particular, and the ways in which what are called Turing machines are being used to make a smarter planet using this kind of linear reasoning. And the alternative that I tried to develop in the book, that's more collaborative kind of dialogue approach to reasoning, is one that is intended to lead to a wiser Earth. Wiser in the sense that instead of just in a linear way, taking one or a few values and trying to maximize them or pursue them in the most efficient way possible, we tried to take all the relevant values from all the stakeholders into account in a balanced way. So it's aiming at a world that's wiser in that sense. And along the way, it involves really thinking about the way we do ethics in a different way, not as justifying our choices, but as solving problems together. And thinking about economics in a different way, not using the calculations of rational economic man in the way that that's been conceived by economists, but thinking of economic choice as a process of making history, of creating new alternatives, of creating new ways of exchanging with each other. And there's a lot to say about all this, but I sort of want to map it out. It gives you a sense of the way in which the book is trying to have a very systematic account of the ways in which reasoning may differ in all these different realms of our life, how those are connected and can be applied both at the personal level and at the institutional level. And there are chapters on each of these. This is the table of contents. The first half of the book focuses on sort of the thinking process. I'll say more about that in just a minute here. And the second half on sort of the institutional structures in economics, politics, technology, and so on. And there are finally a couple chapters at the end that deal with reasoning with people that have really different starting points, different philosophies, religions, creeds. And then a chapter of very practical next steps that we might consider if you agree with some of the things I've been saying. Okay? So that's sort of the overall structure of the book. So let me say a little bit more here about inference, linear inference, right? And what I'll also refer to as monological thinking. The first person who really clearly articulated it as a system was Aristotle in his formal logic, categorical syllogism. That's pretty familiar. It involves having an algorithmic rule, which in this example is one of categorical syllogism that says, in effect, if all A are B and C is A, then C is B. It's just a formal rule that tells you if you start with these premises and you follow the rule, you'll get this conclusion. Okay. So for example, if you start with the premises that all men are mortal and Socrates is a man, then if you follow the algorithmic rule, you get the result that Socrates is mortal. Okay. And that kind of mechanical formal logic, right, advanced a lot since Aristotle. With Euclid, it started to get really interesting because he used it to prove all sorts of interesting things in geometry. And then with Newton, who combined the formal geometry kinds of things with experimental techniques, you get the physics that helps you predict how to shoot a rocket to the moon. And this kind of inferential model of reasoning is one that we sometimes refer to as rocket science. You know, if somebody can do really complicated long strings of mathematical calculation, wow, you know, guy can do rocket science, right? This kind of reasoning is monological in the sense that it starts from premises from one point of view. And so one person, or for that matter, one machine, if it knows the algorithms and can follow them, can generate all the thinking, right? And that kind of thinking is one that underlies much, though by no means all, of the modern AI that has been being used to create smarter cars, smarter phones, smarter planet. That vision is one that IBM argued for in 2009 with the following ad. They said, bit by bit, our planet is getting smarter. And by this, we mean the systems that run the way we live and work as a society. Why now? Because the systems of our planet are increasingly instrumented. They've all got barcodes or other monitoring and control devices. And all these are interconnected with a trillion networked things. And the interconnections are increasingly intelligent with artificial intelligence. Okay, so I want to think a little bit about how do you think about ethics if you think using this kind of reasoning, this algorithmic reasoning, and then we'll go for the contrast. And one classic example that in a lot of philosophy departments they use to teach ethics is the so-called trolley car problem. How many of you guys are familiar with the trolley car dilemmas? Okay, so the idea is there's a trolley car coming down the track. It's going to run over 5 people. They, for some reason, can't hear or see it. They're oblivious, and they're going to get run over unless you pull a lever. But if you pull the lever, the trolley will be diverted. Unfortunately, it will then run over some other person who's also oblivious, right? And so the question becomes, which of these two horns of the dilemma should you choose? And this kind of dilemma is used in places like Harvard. And this is a scene from a course that there's a video of it online by Michael Sandel, who teaches a very popular course on justice at Harvard, where he sort of looks at ways in which utilitarians and Kantians and other folks would have different intuitions about whether you pull the lever or not, right? And current philosophical ethics tends still to be dominated by these two theories that actually come from the 18th century. Jeremy Bentham's utilitarianism and Immanuel Kant's deonic kind of reasoning, they refer to it as. And with utilitarianism, you have this kind of linear reasoning where one premise might be if an option yields the greatest net happiness to all concerned, you should choose it. That's the utilitarian principle. And you have the second premise, the option of pulling the trolley switch to kill 1 instead of 5 will yield the greatest net happiness. And then suddenly the conclusion comes, choose to pull the trolley switch, right? A Kantian might argue instead that if you cannot will a policy from every point of view, don't act on it. There's a lot more to be said about that, but those of you familiar with it will be very familiar. And the idea in the core insight is that we should be acting in ethical ways that respect the rights of every individual from every point of view. We should never treat them as a means in themselves, but always, as Kant put it, an end in themselves. And if you add to that the second premise that you cannot will the policy of pulling the trolley switch from the point of view of the person who will be sacrificed, which some people would, then the conclusion seems to be don't act on the policy pulling the trolley switch. Okay? So debates ensue about this kind of thing. And in fact, a lot of contemporary ethics has trouble getting out of moral relativism because we seem to face these dilemmas that seem unsolvable. But I want to tell you a story about an episode in the video of Michael Sandel's class when he was teaching this. He went on to use a second kind of dilemma. In this one, it's very similar to the first. There's a doctor, though, in this case, and the doctor has 4 or 5 patients in a waiting room. They each need a transplant, heart, lung, something different, each one, right? They'll die without it. In the waiting room, she has a very healthy young patient. He's fallen asleep. So she thinks, if I anesthetize him and harvest his organs, I can save these other 5 people. As a utilitarian, wouldn't I be obligated to do that? Right? So if you can imagine, the students in Sandel's class kind of gasp at horror at the idea, right? But up in the balcony, he's got one person who raises his hand. And this guy's, looks like a prospect for maybe being a hardcore utilitarian who would, sacrifice the one healthy for the five, the one for the many. So Sandel calls on him. And what the student says, though, is, well, I wouldn't sacrifice the healthy person. But what I would do is I'd figure out some way to get a volunteer or somehow pick one of the people that's going to die anyway and harvest their organs to save the other four, right? And when the student suggests that, the class kind of bursts into applause. It's like, what, wow, there's a possible solution, We have to figure out the details. How would you pick who and so on, but at least we're on a track here, right? Sandel, however, just pauses, lets the applause die down. And then he says, well, that's a pretty good idea. In fact, it's a really good idea, except that it misses the whole point of the philosophical example. And then he changes the subject and goes on to other issues. And in doing that, he's following the kind of program of teaching that's common in lots of university settings here, where the idea is to force students to make hard choices, to force them to start with their fundamental premises and draw the conclusions, and to teach them how to do that kind of linear reasoning effectively. But now, if I was out in the world and I was hiring somebody, to make decisions for me, to work for me, right? I would want the kid up in the balcony, right? I would want somebody who looks at a dilemma and says, I wonder if there's another way out of this, right? Who doesn't reason in a linear way and remain trapped monologically in one set of premises, right? So the kind of alternative reasoning that kid starts to exemplify that I would want, and that I think we need throughout our society, involves dialogical reasoning that has a basically different structure. Characteristically, it's guided by heuristic counsels or advices to try. So it's not rules that generate an outcome. It's advice or imperatives that suggest things to look for. They invite and suggest strategies of observation, discernment, search, and creative invention. And instead of an inference from premises to conclusion, as in Aristotle, the process of reasoning would be of the following form. It's got 3 steps. The first is you encounter a difference with others. And the second step is you pursue strategies of negotiation, problem solving, dialogue, conflict transformation. Right? The others, and you don't agree on how you define your terms or your basic starting point, so on. That's all stuff you have to negotiate in the process of reasoning with them in dialogue until you reach genuine voluntary agreement. Okay. This kind of reasoning is something that can be taught. It includes strategies like, for example, multiply your options, come up with a third option. Another one can be focus on the interests behind positions. Find out why people really want what they want to see if you can figure out some better option. Another is to, as some people put it, separate the people from the problem. The idea here is you have to sort of look at relationships and building relationships as part of the negotiation, as well as solving the engineering issues and so on, right? Another kind of suggestion that is often at the core of these strategies involves looking for criteria that are independent of any one individual's will. They're objective in the sense that you can do some research. You can find out what the norms are, what the law is, what's the relevant information. And this kind of reasoning has been researched a lot in the last 50 years. There are lots of books. How many of you guys recognize at least one book up here? Okay, so there have been studies of both of how to do it in US context and then, but also indigenous communities, religious communities, and so on for communal discernment, tribal councils, and so on. And there's a lot of skill in it, but it's been essentially ignored by people who are trying to program artificial intelligences. And it's widely ignored by philosophers who don't think of it as a kind of reasoning that they want to study and teach as the way to teach ethics, right? So part of what this book is about is sort of articulating that and developing it in greater detail. And one of the other books that wasn't on the first page, the previous page here, that's really important in developing this is Gandhi's series of books. And one book about him that's pictured here, The Conquest of Violence by Joan Bondurant. And I mentioned Gandhi especially because I think he provides a really key element for the kind of reasoning that we need to do problem solving and conflict transformation. And that is, he provides an experimental method for discovering objective values. In that sense, he's an moral epistemologist. He has a theory of knowledge. And the way that you do it is through self-sacrifice, through self-suffering, not in random ways, but in very intentional ways, in which you put your body and your life and your resources on the line. So if you think, for example, as he did, that the British insistence that Indians should submit to British rule and that they should pay a salt tax is a violation of your sovereignty as a people and your dignity as a person, then you can resist that by making salt and getting arrested, maybe getting beat up, right? Through that kind of self-sacrifice that we're familiar with through the civil rights movement and so on as well in the US. And part of the idea is here that experimentally contemplating being beat up gives you pause. It makes you think, am I really sure I'm onto a moral truth here? You know, right? So it provides a discernment method. It also provides a method of demonstration. So people who are willing to make those sacrifices to get beat up and so on, they, in some cases, not by no means all, they may be able to demonstrate to others, including their oppressors, that there is a real moral objective value here that's at stake, and that they're willing to sacrifice for. And sometimes, as Gandhi would put it, they melt the hearts of the oppressors or others, right? So it can demonstrate moral truths. And the third thing that it can do when it's employed strategically in systematic ways is that it can also defend moral truths. So there are ways in which, by filling the jails, in the case of the sit-ins of the lunch counters in Nashville in the 1960s, by obstructing business in downtown Nashville, they could make it impossible for businessmen to make any money. So that eventually they go to the mayor and they say, you know what, this Jim Crow, it just costs us too much. You got to do something, mayor. Get rid of this stuff because it's not working for us, you know. Okay. There's a lot more to be said about that. And the chapter that deals with politics and changing our political system deals with it in some length. Here's just sort of a brief sketch. I won't go into it in detail. I just will mention that this chart sort of provides a kind of summary that, you know, on the fly here tonight, it's probably not worth reading a little screen, but in economics and politics and technology, the book is offering systematic ways to use Gandhian and other dialogical approaches in the way we think about and rethink economics, how we change people from being consumers into being history makers in their economic behavior, how we reconfigure our approach to politics so that we see conflict as not essential to it, but that we can actually relate to others in conflict transforming ways, and so on. And there's a bunch of stuff about AI. And just briefly, the book talks and describes at some length two models for AI, one being the sort of monological inferential model that is associated, for example, with the Smarter Planet vision, and the other that I refer to as the Turing child, which Alan Turing actually, in a really influential article in the 1950s, actually described both these models. And we're at a point in history where the second model of a Turing child is actually becoming technologically, I don't know if I could quite say possible, but it's just, we're approaching the point where things more and more like the vision that Turing had, where instead of programming something in a linear way, you educate it, you socialize it through interaction. It's becoming possible. How many of you guys have used ChatGPT or something like it, or seen things? Okay, so there are more and more of these online AIs that you can interact with in what seem like conversational ways. And they actually can get better in their performance as the conversation continues. And so part of what the book is about is the limitations of the current models in doing that and the ways in which they're problematic. They involve black boxes that actually can have conversational partners that can get very weird and very disturbing and may create all sorts of problems, but also offer some really interesting possibilities. So I'm going to kind of skim through, because of the way we're running with time here, a detailed discussion of all that, but we can come back to it. And I might just briefly sketch 5 principles for good AI that the book outlines and develops in much more detail. And one is that we should define our guiding goal for the AI as the pursuit of genuine voluntary agreements. So if you have an AI system that's helping you run your school or your prison or your farm or your town, then it should be structured so that it promotes dialogical processes that arrive at genuine agreements from all the participants involved. And that it should do so, secondly, using methods of collaborative dialogue, like multiplier options and this other stuff. And then third, that it should frame the structures of the relationships and commitments, the way we think about what's going on with the AI, as a human ecological system that includes and is incorporated by people and nature and machines. That there are different kinds of intelligence that people and dogs and plants and trees and machines all have, and that we should try to think about how those can complement each other in a systemic way. And we should also make the system as open as possible to discerning and engaging with emergent realities in emergent contexts. That we should, and this is where the book gets, it's where the Quakerism stuff comes out for me in some ways. It should be spirit-led. Dialogue should be something in which we try to listen deeply to each other and the situation we're in, and discern the deepest meanings we can find and use them to frame what we're going to do. And in that sense, because of that kind of deep listening, we can be led by the spirit of the situation. All these ideas are connected with one core insight that struck me when I was meditating on the problem of how can we have ethical AI, which is that to the extent that we have these conversational models and we have a sort of a Turing child, a child model that we're going to socialize for AI, it takes a village to raise a child. And it takes an ethical village to raise an ethical child. And so if we really want to think seriously about how we're going to have ethical AI, ethical, legal, safe AI, then we have to have an ethical, legal, safe village, which means we have a lot of work to do in many ways, I think. So more to say all about that, but I think I'd like to take just a moment for a song and then open it for questions, okay? And this song summarizes part of the sense that the book is continually trying to come back to, which has to do with a point that Tom mentioned, optimism. You know, I try to describe ways in which change is coming whether we want it or not. AI is coming to pervade our world. There are lots of other changes from economics and politics that are pervading. And the question is, what kind of change is going to come, right? This is a song about the kind of change that we should be working for. And again, if you read the book, there's a QR code at a certain point, and you take your smartphone out and read it. It will take you to a website where you'll hear this song. There's a change that's a coming. There's a change that's a coming. There's a change that's a coming soon. And it's coming like a hurricane. Coming, I drought. And it's coming like a glacier melting. And they say it's gonna be at least 2 degrees. It says it's gonna be at least 2 degrees. Says it's gonna be at least 2 degrees soon. And they said maybe much more. And they said maybe much more. And they said maybe much more than 2. Oh, but we all won't let it, 'cause we all finally get it, and we all gonna make a change. Like the 19th century and slavery will end fossil fuel dependency. Like the fall of the Berlin Wall will make a change. Like an old time spiritual revival or a YouTube video gone viral with 1 billion of us on bicycles make a change. Oh, hey, hey, hey. Hey, 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 hey. We're gonna cut by half our material consumption, invest in real creative destruction, start a political eruption, make a change. Oh, with piles of political donations, campaigning door to door in conversations, we'll take back the government of our nations, make a change. Yes, there's a change that's a coming. There's a change that's a coming. There's a change that's a coming soon. Because we're coming like a hurricane. We're coming like a hurricane. We're coming like a hurricane soon. Oh yes, we're coming like a hurricane. We're coming like a hurricane. We're coming like a hurricane soon. 2, 3, now. Thank you. Thanks. So that probably gave you some sense of the book. It's sort of a mix of, well, exciting stuff you might applaud at and other stuff that you sort of might get a little drifty on. So questions and answers and discussion, dialogue. Let's open it up here. And yeah. Yep. And Matt's also going to be looking online. So if those of you online have questions, don't hesitate to let him know. Yeah.
Hold on, give me 1 second.
Oh, okay, sorry.
I gotta remember how to turn this thing on.
Okay.
Well, you can go ahead. I'll work on it. Whoever had that question.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm going to play a little bit of devil's advocate.
Sure.
Okay, so it seems that the rainbow rule is somewhat effective Taiwan. China wants Taiwan to be, their country, and we're willing to respect that. But at the same time, the people of Taiwan want to run their own country. And so we're respecting that too. And this seems very fragile right now in the world.
Yeah.
So it seems to me that might makes right is the rule for maybe the top 5 adversaries of ours. So doesn't it make sense that our computer system AI works with the reality that might makes right is the rule?
Right. That's a great question. Okay. Thank you very much. With the example of Taiwan, the Ukraine would be another interesting example to wrestle with this. Doesn't it seem like might makes right in the world? And first of all, I think the phrase might makes right is misleading. I think the people who say it don't, it's not really that might makes right, it's that might makes is. Right? The idea is that might makes it the way it's going to be, whether you like it or not. But by phrasing it as, well, might makes right, it seems to add a certain authority and legitimacy and morality to things that have been imposed through violence, right? Rather than through, for example, Satyagraha and Gandhian methods. Yeah.
If the people who are in the right don't have might, they will be dominated. And the tactics of Gandhi worked because he was dealing with mid-20th century British people who had an imperfect democracy, but a democracy and a certain set of values where their hearts were perhaps open to being melted. Same with mid-20th century United States and civil rights protesters. And of course, Dr. King was very influenced by Gandhi. If you have an adversary like, say, the Third Reich of Adolf Hitler, and probably the current Chinese regime, how are those tactics possibly going to work against a ruthless adversary?
Right. So this is an empirical question, I think. Right? I mean, I think there are people who will approach it very philosophically and just make a commitment as pacifists or not on it. But I think you can at least, and I would approach it empirically, right? And there's been some empirical study. There's a really interesting book by Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stefan, where they used some statistical analysis. They gathered data on all the sort of violent and nonviolent attempts at regime change in the 20th century and into the early part of up to about 2008. And they came up with some really interesting results. I've got the results up here on the board, part of them anyway. What they found was that consistently over the 20th century and up through 2006, nonviolent campaigns on average succeeded more often than violent ones. And they also found that nonviolent campaigns actually succeeded increasingly well through the 20th century. So that it looked like they were getting more powerful, right? And they found there were some particular advantages to them that, for example, that after the regime change was over, with violent regimes, you tended not to get democracies, whereas with nonviolent ones, they tended to get more democratic, just results. If you look at some of the examples that this data is based on, you have to realize that sometimes nonviolence does not work. It's really clear, right? Just as sometimes violence does not work. That's also really clear. But it's noteworthy that, for example, in 1988, I was working with people doing imaging. I won't get the long story. I'll just note, in 1989, the Berlin Wall fell, and Eastern Europe was liberated. And they were liberated from a very oppressive governments in Eastern Europe that were backed by the Soviet Union, which had nuclear weapons. And in fact, realist strategists who have the sort of might makes right vision of the world, like Henry Kissinger, for example, in the 1980s, had no strategy, none, for liberating Eastern Europe. And when it was actually liberated, It was the result of work by people like Valenza and other folks who used nonviolent techniques. When it was actually liberated, political realists were just mystified. People like Kissinger just really, they didn't have an explanation for how this could happen, right? Because it involves a different frame of thinking, but also different understandings of the nature of power. So one of the key things about this alternative conception of power is that one that Gene Sharp has emphasized. Sharp has the idea that nonviolence isn't just about melting the opponent's heart. It's about using alternative forms of power and struggle. And he notes that a government can only be successful, an occupier can only occupy effectively, if people will obey orders. And if people refuse to obey, and they have developed the resources to do that effectively, then they can thwart the attempt to conquer them. Not always, but often. And in some cases, like in Eastern Europe, the liberation of Eastern Europe, or in the end of apartheid in South Africa, or in lots of other cases around the world, regime change can be successful. So now, in the case of Taiwan, boy, that's a really hard case, just as Ukraine is. So I don't have any easy, glib answers to the concrete case you're pointing out, right? I don't. But I do want to say that I think that it's open to, it's an empirical question as to whether there would be ways of using nonviolence through boycotts, through sanctions, through other kinds of strategies, through other kinds of techniques. It's just an open question. And at any given point in time, how effective nonviolence is can actually vary, I think. So through much of the 20th century, it was becoming more effective. And I think part of the reason was that not a lot of research prior to Gandhi had been done as to how to do nonviolence, to do effective direct action campaigns. And so, I mean, think about it. Any technology that hasn't been researched much, if people start putting some money into researching it, it can tend to become more productive and effective relatively quickly, right? On the other hand, the reality is that since 2006, and this was done, there have been some really frustrating failures of nonviolence, like in the Middle East with the Arab Spring. And part of what's going on there is probably that, to some extent, dictators and oppressors are they're learning some of the strategies that nonviolent people have been using, and they're coming up with countermeasures. So it's kind of like, in a sense, an arms race between violent arms and nonviolent arms. And it's an open question as to where that will go and who will be most successful next. I don't know if that's a very satisfying answer, but it seems to me that's sort of the kind of answer that I would give. And I think that the other thing that I would note is just that when it comes to thinking about this overall structure of the world and what kind of power base we want to use to justify and to defend our political systems, I think that for the nonviolent, you can say it may not always work, right? But the violent, in a world of weapons of mutually assured destruction, promises to not work in a very fatal and permanent way. If we arrive through, like in the Ukraine, if it escalates to the point that we actually have a nuclear war, we're going to all be saying, wait, the other alternative, we need an alternative, Yeah, as I say, maybe not the best answer, but that's sort of what I would give initially. Okay. Yeah.
There was a question online. What are the characteristics of a Turing child?
Oh, okay. Let's see, maybe I can go back here. Well, maybe I'll just say, a Turing child is going to be a kind of AI system that uses neural nets or other kinds of evolutionary systems for developing its behavior. And instead of being programmed in a linear way, like good old-fashioned AI, it'll be trained. And some version of the kind of thing that's currently being done, for example, with ChatGPT and the other things that have been making the news, would be involved, where the behavior evolves as it's reinforced, right? And it's an open question as to just how, to what extent that can approximate to the kind of evolved behavior that humans have. But certainly it seems like there's very significant progress towards exhibiting behavior that looks in emergent ways as though it's involves something that's like intentionality, where the systems, because of the way they're rewarded, learn to write essays that have conclusions and have good opening sentences. And when the opening sentence isn't very good, they get feedback. And the next time they vary their behavior, and they keep varying it until the selection reinforcement system rewards the kind of result they're providing. Turing envisioned that we would have systems that are using that kind of evolutionary programming that would be at a point where you could start to socialize the Turing child machine, he was calling it. He didn't stick his own name on this, but people in the profession do talk about Turing machines. So it's, I think, helpful to contrast them with Turing children, where they're talking about these two models. And he envisioned them going to school, perhaps, or certainly socializing with teachers, parents, and the like. And the principles that would govern the kind of behavior that you would try to get to emerge through this kind of the use of appropriate training data and reinforcement and socialization would be, I think, like the kinds I've listed here on the screen, that involve dialogical reasoning in community, guided by emergent objective values. Yeah.
The previous discussion on Ukraine and Russia and China and Taiwan seems to be an A wins or B wins discussion, and more in tune with your book. Where is collaboration? Already countries have come together to invite Russia and Ukraine to peace talks.
Mhm.
It's going to be a hard sell. They're far apart, but it's a process that could avoid the ultimate choice of one or the other. I think we've talked in the past about this, and the story is too long to tell, but in 1981, a president of an African country came to Washington to buy weapons to go to war with his neighbor. The State Department was ready to provide the weapons. A group of Republicans, Democrats, and senior government officials met at a breakfast and talked this president out of going to war with his neighbor, and suggested he meet with the president of that other nation. And they signed a document guaranteeing their borders. That document still exists since 1981. There are always other options than A and B.
Thanks, Fred. Yeah.
First, thank you, Gray, for illuminating and thought-provoking presentation. Two thoughts that may form a question. One is, as I've listened to other programs on AI, I've heard that the person who programs, if that's the right word, an AI system, their biases and values are incorporated into the system, so that the system has some of those prejudices or biases. The second thought is, I heard a speaker at COA at the Institute this week talking about, I was from an indigenous speaker. He's a photographer for National Geographic, saying that solutions to the problems we face are not going to come from the dominant worldview. They're going to come from indigenous voices and paradigms that have not yet been able to give input. So I don't know who is responsible, who creates the AI and how might different perspectives than those dominant ones that have brought us to the situation we're in be incorporated into developing a different kind of artificial intelligence.
So great. That's a great question, set of observations that I would say the following things about. First, the biases and values that can enter into the AI that like ChatGPT and so on that you're increasingly seeing on search engines, on Bing and on Google and so on. Those they can be sort of programmed in the way that you're talking about, but they also enter in through what's called the training data, where in order to learn things to say and how to respond to prompts, basically the machines are looking at lots of training data, lots of examples of behavior. And the behavior they look at is what's on the internet mostly, right? And in Wikipedia, and sources like that. So they observe what's being said in what sequence, right? And so if there are trolls or other people who are sort of saying nasty, horrible things on the internet, then they're sort of absorbing that as appropriate responses to say in response to particular prompts, right? And there's work that's done by OpenAI, for example, to do what they call reinforcement learning with human feedback, where when the machine does learn from, say, a troll to make sharp remarks or be intimidating or what have you, they start to catch that, and then they offer human feedback more directly to try and train that out of the system. Just the way if you had a dog that might have genetic material that makes it behave a little bit like a kind of snappy wolf and maybe take little bites out of small children and stuff like that, you might try to train that behavior out of it. It's an analogous kind of process. Now, what? Absolutely, yeah, absolutely, yeah. That's exactly right. That's what you're trying to do, trying to inject the trainer's biases. Just as you try to inject your values when you train a dog, for example. I think it's important to note that there can be problems with the values that the machine picks up. So if you train a machine to observe judges making parole decisions, and then use the machine to provide, sort of an efficient way to decide parole cases. If the judges that it's been observing are biased, then the machine is going to tend to be biased, right? So you're going to have to train that out. On the other hand, it's important to note that, judges are biased. And one of the ways we can discover this is by using machines to do statistical analysis of their behavior. And if you find that the judges consistently are sentencing people of color or people of a certain marginalized category to longer sentences, then that at least puts up a flag with, maybe there's something with the behavior of these humans, right? So is it possible, in principle at least, that we can have kind of nudging both of machines and of humans towards moral improvement, if we can figure out how to discern what we might want to call emergent moral values? And that's where I think Gandhian techniques are really important, because they provide at least one way of thinking about how we might try to discern what those kinds of values might be that we should be working towards. Well, it's kind of a long answer. So there was a second part to your question that.
Well, I was struck by this comment that the photographer gave examples from Greenland and Hawaii and Ecuador of indigenous people who were finding solutions to ecological problems.
I couldn't agree more that I think that that the more diverse kinds of quote training data and the better quality that we include for the AI, the better. And I think that there are lots of examples of ways in which indigenous people have different kinds of traditions of dialogical reasoning that are really good. They provide ways of listening to each other, ways of mediating disputes. Some are just very different from what we might do, but in say in the US, in the dominant culture, but we can learn a lot from. A lot, yeah.
One thing that I was hearing this week about AI, we're still looking at AI as far as 101010 and a bunch of siloed computerized mechanisms, making much more intelligent and much more diverse and drawing from many more sources of those silos, like indigenous people versus a Yale professor's economics. But what nobody's really discussed and what is maybe most frightening to me is that the speed of all of this is going to become infinite. Because when quantum computing kicks in, we're not going to have ones and zeros. We're going to have an infinite amount in between those in that same time period. So when all of these AIs are buzzing along on very complicated situations, we have nobody that's being able to coordinate how that chaos comes out. And I haven't heard anybody yet discuss quantum AI, quantum programming, because that's going to be out of our control very quickly unless we start discussing that problem.
It's a really important issue. There are all sorts of.
How do you teach ethics when it's buzzing faster than we can control it, looking at options? This problem is, it's not new. We've had AI ever since we've had computing. There's computer learning all along. It's just become a buzzword in media. So all of a sudden we're getting on the bandwagon of thinking about it, but we need to jump one step further to either slow down so that we can problem solve and manage. And so I think that we need to be thinking of AI, not as we think of it as yes, no, incremental decision makings, but how we control it when there are no passwords, because it's able to find all of our passwords immediately. So this whole security of it needs to be addressed up front, I think.
I agree. I think the urgency of this is really, it's pretty striking. The people who are in the industry, Sam Altman at OpenAI and people in Google and elsewhere, a lot of them are really disturbed and worried. And they're continuing to build their models because of competitive economic pressures. It's really the kind of village we have is not ethical in the way that would promote slowing down in ways that are ethically appropriate, that I think the leaders agree, but they're caught up in their role, their position, the logic of their job to continue accelerating this process. So I think, sort of three things that I would mention in terms of responding to that. One is I think that a sort of a national initiative in the US, along with collaboration at the international level, to halt the move to higher level generative AI, to go sort of from GPT-4 to GPT-5, just to slow things down so that people can catch up and figure out what's going on, so that people who are legislating this stuff and customers who are dealing with it and businesses and everyone else can sort of figure out what's going on and how to adapt to it. That's one really important thing. I think that a second way of slowing things down can happen at the state level. So here in Maine, I think that we should have we should be considering some kind of action along the lines of a bill for ethical, legal, safe AI, where the state would say, as a state, we're not going to use any software or employ any subcontractors who use software that is not demonstrably ethical, legal, and safe. And if just Maine does that, it's not that big a deal. But if Maine and California and Wisconsin and others start to do it, then you start to create first of all, a market for ethical, legal, safe AI. So you start to drive the market forces in the way you want them to go. And you also slow things down because it's not easy to make ethical, legal, safe AI. especially to demonstrate that it is. And so it's going to take a while to develop that, right? And I think there are efforts in Europe, in China, and elsewhere where folks are really worried about the safety issues. And it's possible to do that kind of thing. And the third thing I think is really important is to really be thinking about all this in terms of this idea that it takes an ethical village to have an ethical child. We really have to think about the ethical structure of our society and how we're going to change the way our economy and politics work in order to have a system that isn't driven by corporate profit to produce AI that maximizes income by the kinds of techniques that, for example, social media has been doing for the last 15 years, that blithely ignores the fact that, you know, children are getting high rates of anxiety and depression and suicide because of the way they've been treated like clickbait. Anyway, if anybody's interested in working on those issues, I'm interested in lobbying here in Maine, for example, on those issues. I would love to talk with folks who would like to work on those. And I've already talked with Lynn Williamson and Nicole Grahowski. They're interested maybe doing something. So people who would like to lobby and work and problem solve around what would be reasonable and appropriate and workable stuff for some kind of local initiative on that, I'd love to talk with them. Thank you, guys. Thank you very much. Really, I do really want to thank you all because I know I sort of let my pointy-headed professor part of me come out just a little bit here tonight. So I appreciate you all patiently listening to it and wrestling with it. Thanks.